that depiction, I mean, particularly thinking of the Adolf character, but I think in many ways just as much the Freud character, and even possibly to a lesser extent the Jung character. You're as a filmmaker, you're tackling big, iconic, and to a large extent cliched figures. You know we have an idea of Adolf Hitler, which is I think often a very two-dimensional idea
Yes.
that he's you know almost just Hitler's evil. That's all you need to know. But he has a mustache and he's evil.
Right.
Freud, he has a beard. He has these little funny round glasses, smokes a cigar, and is obsessed with sex. That's all you need to know about these two characters. And
Yes.
you decide as a film director to tackle both of these huge but thin, potentially thin. I mean, obviously,
Right.
some of us know more about some of these characters than others, but I'm talking my imagined public don't. They just know them as cliches, and you tackle both of these figures in one film in very complex ways. Does, that must have felt like a risk as a
Oh,
filmmaker.
yes. A horrible risk. Um, but it was so well, also is because Adolf is a young man here. And I mean, I think one of the things I love about it is to put, I mean, there was one producer who I spoke to early in the process of putting together the film, who said to me, who was an Israeli, and he said, anytime you make the biography of anyone, some people will be offended because they think of it as you're making excuses for them. You show someone who kills children, but you see his mother was mean to him, and you can think, oh, Um, but I think what the attempt to do is to de-idolize Adolf, to put him in time, um, and to. So I think that's one of the powerful things, and also to show him developing the role that anti-Semitism plays. That you see it kind of the way it puts him together in a way. And it's not by chance, of course, that all these extreme ethno-nationalisms that we see today all have an enemy. I mean, and maybe the Jews are one part in many of them. Um, we could argue about whether even in the, I see even anti-Semitism at work in support for Zionism among Christian evangelicals. I think there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism at work in the supposed support of Israel, but also obviously the role of the Palestinians, but also we could France mainly. When I made the documentary about undocumented migrants arriving on the island of Mytilene or Lesbos, I could see and the role these vulnerable people, these stateless people, and Hannah Arendt said, the importance of making Jews stateless was for the actions of the Nazis, and then these. Of course, the Palestinians in Gaza are stateless. So, and in contrast to these nationalisms, this power of the state. So the way that Adolf forms a kind of ethno-nationalism that has its roots in this kind of tribalism, and on the other hand, its roots in the politics, the popular politics of Karl Lueger, the mayor, and the similarity between him and Trump. Trump recently said of Chuck Schumer, who's a senator, New York senator, and who is Jewish, he said, "Oh, he's Palestinian. He used to be, in my opinion, he's Palestinian. He used to be Jewish, but now he's Palestinian." And Carl Luger, in the time of Freud, whose most famous statement is, "I decide who is a Jew." And that was an act of violence, that you can't hold on to anything. And this is, of course, aimed at, many of the immigrants in Vienna at that time are escaping the pogroms in Russia and such. So these two ideas that he puts together, and then their echoes in the present, certainly are something that I've found, again, very interesting. And also the way that this period that Alain, that the work focuses on, which is before the First World War, it's where these ideas are coming from and coming together. It's not what we usually see. It's not the Second World War. They're in a much more early point, and of course, these two young men are in this early moments in their lives, and I think because of that, it's in a way more troubling, because it does take the risk of making Adolf. You see his development, and that can be troubling for some people. But I think it also it's very important in a way to be able to think about how these ideas come about in time, and the role they play in group psychology, and also individual psychology in that sense, or subject psychology.
Yeah, and I mean the earliness as well. It makes me think you're almost invited as a viewer to engage in what I call a kind of frustrated speculation that you're looking at this very early point, and if we go back to that point, if things had been different, if one thing had happened differently, if the Adolf character had loosened up a bit, if he'd allowed himself to have a relationship with Molly, would that have changed history? If Freud and Jung had managed to take their conversation in a more fruitful direction and work out their differences, would that have changed the history of psychoanalysis? And there's a kind of interesting thought experiment there, because we know that's not what happened, and yet we're put back in that moment and allowed to confront that possibility, which again goes back to that point of universals and particulars, or big pictures and small pictures, that would it really have made any difference if one character had behaved differently? And it goes back to that point of a cliche that we think of Freud as being the inventor of psychoanalysis, but yeah, he may have been the originator, but there were very quickly lots of other people engaged in psychoanalysis, pulling it in different directions.
Well,
for time to come. Hitler as well. He wasn't acting alone, but the neat cliche we have is that he's the bad guy. He's the one who made this happen. But if he'd never existed, there's every chance someone else would have done the same thing.
Right. Yeah, to me, I think one of the things you get in French, which you don't have in English, is and it's very important, obviously, in psychoanalysis, is the idea of répétition, which in French is a rehearsal. We say rehearsal, so it gets kind of lost. But in French, a rehearsal is a répétition. And how the work of an actor involves a repetition, which at the same time within that there's differences. There can be very subtle differences, but for the actor, they're vitally important within that repetition that changes. And at the end of V13, of course, there's a clips of Hitler's return to Vienna. So this whole question about, I often this quote of Beckett's fail again, fail better. I'm butchering that, but still this question of repetition, and which is to say a certain kind of pessimism, but still within that the possibility for change, the possibility for things to be crucially different. And I think, that's also the reason why to put Benjamin, and when we look at the rise of these, is there's an element of repetition, but, and our ability to address them will in some ways probably fail, but maybe we can fail better,
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's probably quite a good place to end. I mean, you talked there about the footage at the end. So people who've not seen the film, at the end of the film, there's archival footage of Hitler and the motorcade coming to Vienna, which in Lacanian terms seems to operate as a really powerful point de capiton at the end of the film. But I guess the point to remember about a point de capiton is it's a temporary ending. It's a point
Right.
from which we retroactively understand, but we always move on from the point de capiton. It's not an absolute end, and that seems to me that the stopping point of the film. The film ends with this point that we all know that this young man did go on to become Hitler, and all the awful things that now reminds us of, that now symbolizes. But as you said, that's not the ending. There's,
Right.
we repeat all those mistakes, but there's still the opportunity to choose, which again, in the film, you have
Yes.
the point with Hitler, the Hitler character staging a play, which, again, for the benefit of people who've not yet seen the film, the play, the stage set of the play is two doorways, and one doorway has above it those who can change, and the other one has those who cannot change. And the various characters, all representative of what are presented in the play within the film as Jewish institutions. So we have a Marxist or a unionist representing Marx. We have a psychoanalyst representing the Jewish science, and they're all forced to go through this doorway of those who cannot change. And then the character of Hugo is told to make his choice between the two doors, and he chooses not to choose, which seems
Right.
really kind of a hopeful moment. You're faced with
Yes.
a binary choice, and yet there is always a third choice that you can walk
Right.
away.
Yes. And and he's just been talking in a dream where he hears Freud saying no to the Medusa. Um, uh, and of course, no, and echoes with Antigone, of course. There's that moment of his saying no. Um, so there is this complexity to the end of the film, which again is tough, but of it's not clear. Again, Adolf, when his last boast to the young woman Molly is, "I'll be back." There will be a return, and of course, film repeats. This we can replay this film, so it brings up, and this is true about modernity and machinery and the ability things repeating versus the repetition of the actor, who's going to say the same lines, but he's going to say them slightly differently. He's going to, and each time do it a little bit differently. And then, so it's a very powerful set of questions and possibilities, especially, I think, in the present moment, because I think many people have a feeling of repetition, that something culturally is returning that we would never want to return. And yet it's returning on a group level. And how do you address that? Makes the film, I think, very, very poignant at this time.
No, absolutely, and I think it makes it a properly ethical film in a Lacanian sense as well. That you're not seeking to tell the viewer through the film what to think, what to do. You're
Right.
staging a complex provocation. By complex, I mean, it's not a straightforward poke. You're staging a very complex set of ideas that leaves the viewer at the end to make a decision and puts them in a position where they have to make a decision, which makes it very, very powerful. Richard, it's been an absolute delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming back to Lacan in Scotland. It's always a delight to see your films. It's always incredibly engaging, thought-provoking, and even more so to have the luxury of talking to you about them afterwards as well. So I hope.
Thank you so much.
I hope you make your next film. You'll come back and talk to us again, whether it's about psychoanalysis or not.
Okay, good, because it's time to move on. I think I've done my films about psychoanalysis now. Great, thank you again. Good to see you.
Thanks. Really lovely to see you.